The man didn't knock. That was the first thing people in Dust Halo would remember later, not what he said, not what he took. The fact that Chet Dolan walked through the front door of the Mercer homestead on a Tuesday morning like he owned the floorboards under Eliza's feet, because in his mind, he already did. He had the papers, he had the sheriff in his pocket, and he had 6 men on horseback waiting outside in the yard, just to make sure nobody got any ideas about pushing back. Eliza was at the stove when he came in. She didn't scream. She didn't reach for anything. She just turned around with a cast iron ladle, still dripping in her hand, and looked at him the way a woman looks at a problem she's been expecting for a long time. "You've got till sundown," Dolan said. He didn't bother to lower his voice. "After that, anything left in this house belongs to me." He walked back out without closing the door. If you were standing in that kitchen, watching a man treat your entire life like an inconvenience he needed to clear off his schedule before lunch, what would you do? If you had nothing left but one canvas sack, one worn dress, and a dime that had been in your coat pocket, so long the face on it had almost rubbed smooth, where would you go? This is the story of a woman who didn't answer those questions the way anyone expected her to. She didn't fall apart. She didn't beg. She walked out of that house before sundown, not because Chet Dolan told her to, but because she decided she was done letting men like him decide what she was worth. Her name was Eliza Mercer, and this is where her story really begins. If this is your first time on this channel, welcome, and please take a moment to subscribe so you never miss a story. Hit the like button if you're already feeling something, and drop a comment below telling me the city and country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to Dust Halo. The town of Dust Halo sat at the edge of nowhere particular, the kind of place that appeared on older maps, spelled 2 different ways depending on who drew them. It had a saloon, a feed store, a livery with a broken weather vane that had been pointing northwest for 11 years regardless of wind direction, and approximately 300 souls who had learned to keep their eyes down and their opinions to themselves. The frontier had a way of teaching that lesson to people. Usually it only took once. Eliza arrived on foot, which told anyone paying attention something important about her situation. Women who came to Dust Halo by choice came by wagon or stage. Women who came on foot were running from something, or had already been run out of somewhere else, and the distinction mattered to the people watching from doorways and windows. As she moved down the center of the main street in the early afternoon, canvas sack hanging from one shoulder, her face carrying the flat expression of someone who had decided not to feel anything until she had a roof and something warm to drink. She had been walking since before dawn. Her boots had a split along the left sole that she'd been managing with a folded piece of leather she'd cut from an old belt 3 days ago. Folded leather had shifted sometime around mid-morning, and for the last 4 hours she'd been aware of every pebble and divot in the road in a way that made concentration difficult. She pushed open the door of the Dust Halo saloon and walked in. The room went quiet, the way rooms do when something unexpected interrupts the usual rhythm. Not violently quiet, just the brief pause of men looking up from cards and glasses to assess whether what they were seeing was something they needed to respond to. Eliza stood just inside the door and let them look. She had learned years ago that the fastest way to get a room to relax was to give it time to finish its assessment. Men, especially, needed a moment to catalog a woman, decide which category she belonged to, and settle back into whatever they'd been doing. Took about 8 seconds. She counted. When the noise started up again, she walked to the bar. The bartender was a broad man with a dark mustache and the kind of careful expression that came from years of reading situations before they escalated. He watched her come toward him without reaching for anything, which she took as a reasonable sign. "Coffee," she said. "If you have it, I've got it." He didn't move right away. "You got the price of it?" She put the dime on the bar. It was her last one, and they both probably knew it, but she set it down flat and didn't look at it after she released it, which was a thing she'd practiced. Looking at money after you'd committed to spending it gave too much away. He poured the coffee and took the dime, and she wrapped both hands around the tin cup and felt the heat move into her fingers and for a moment closed her eyes. Just a moment. Long enough to remind herself that warmth still existed in the world, that she hadn't somehow wandered past it permanently. "You looking for work?" the bartender said. It wasn't kindness exactly. It was more like useful information, offered without attachment. "I'm looking for honest work," she said, which isn't the same thing, depending on the establishment. He had the decency to almost smile at that. "I run a clean place. I'm sure you believe that." She looked around. "But I can cook. I can mend. I can clean anything from a cast iron skillet to a set of leather harnesses. I'm not looking for charity. I'm looking for someone who needs something done and is willing to pay for it to be done correctly." The bartender studied her for a moment with the particular expression of a man calculating whether a situation was more trouble than it was worth. Before he could land on either side of that calculation, a voice came from the far end of the bar. "You said you can cook." It wasn't a question. The man asking it was tall, somewhere in his middle 30s, with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that looked like it had been set against something difficult. For so long it had forgotten how to unclench. He was sitting at the far end of the bar with a glass of water, not whiskey, water which told Eliza something. She wasn't sure what yet. "I said I can cook," she confirmed. "How long have you been cooking?" "Since I was 7 years old." She turned to face him. "Why?" "Because I've got 6 men at my ranch who are eating burned beans and hardtack 3 times a day and calling it food," he said. "And I've been trying for 2 months to find someone willing to come out and do something about it." What happened to whoever was doing it before? Something shifted in his face. Not pain exactly. Something older than pain, my mother. Eliza didn't say she was sorry. She'd found that people who were genuinely grieving didn't particularly need to be told the grief was valid. They already knew. What they needed was something practical, something that moved forward rather than turning back toward the loss. "How many miles out?" she asked. 4 roughly. 5 if the creek's flooded. Flooded? Not yet. What's the pay? He named a number. It was modest, not insulting, but modest. She didn't counter it immediately, because countering immediately told people you were desperate, and desperation was a negotiating position she couldn't afford to occupy. "A week's trial," she said. "If you think I'm worth keeping on after that, we discuss terms. If not, you pay me for the week, and I find my own way back." He looked at her for a long time. Not the way men sometimes looked at women they were assessing for reasons that had nothing to do with cooking. It was more the look of a man trying to determine whether someone was telling the truth about themselves. "Fair enough," he said and set his glass down. "I'm Whit Calder, Eliza Mercer." He didn't extend his hand. She didn't expect him to. They weren't friends yet. They were 2 people who had arrived at a practical arrangement, and in Eliza's experience, that was actually a better foundation than friendship, because it was honest about what it was. "Wazen's outside when you're ready," he said, and walked toward the door. She finished her coffee first. She did it deliberately, not to make a point, but because it was her dime, and she'd earned every degree of warmth in that cup. Whit Calder waited outside, without complaint, which she filed away. The road to the Calder ranch was exactly as rough as the condition of Whit's wagon suggested it would be. He drove without talking, which suited her. The afternoon light was going orange and thin along the edge of the flats, and the wind had picked up the way it did in this part of the territory. When the temperature started to drop, not a cold wind yet, just a busy one, moving through the dried grass with a sound like something running. She watched the land, without asking questions about it. There would be time for questions. Right now she was building a picture. The canvas sack sat between her boots on the wagon floor. In it she had 2 changes of clothes, a small bone-handled knife, a coil of waxed thread and 3 needles, a folded letter she hadn't opened in 4 months and wasn't sure she ever would, and a tin box containing dried herbs she'd gathered herself, because she didn't trust the ones sold at most trading posts. The letter was from her sister. It had arrived 6 weeks, after Eliza left the Mercer homestead for the last time, forwarded twice before it found her. She knew what it probably said without opening it. Her sister had always been better at saying the right things in writing than in person. But right now, Eliza couldn't afford comfort. Comfort had a way of cracking something open that she needed to keep closed, at least until she had ground beneath her feet. She was 31 years old, and she had been married for 6 years to a man named Thomas Mercer, who had died of a fever the previous winter, not before he'd borrowed against everything they had and left her with debts she hadn't known existed until his creditors began appearing at the door one by one, and then all at once, and then finally in the form of Chet Dolan, who held the largest debt and who had been patient for exactly as long as it served him to be. She had not been a bad wife. She had not been a perfect one either. Thomas had been difficult in ways she hadn't fully understood when she agreed to marry him at 24, and she had adapted, adjusted, found the shape of the life she'd been handed, and tried to make it livable. She was good at that, making things livable. It was both her strength and the thing she sometimes resented most about herself, that she was so capable of enduring. She didn't want to just endure anymore. She wanted something different, though she couldn't have said precisely what. Something that was actually hers. She looked out at the flat land rolling past and let the thoughts settle back down to wherever she kept thoughts she couldn't act on yet. Calder Ranch appeared in the last real light of day, and her first impression was not encouraging. The main house was solid enough, built from good timber, with a foundation that had been laid by someone who understood what they were doing. The yard was chaos. Equipment left at odd angles. A section of fence near the barn that had given up entirely and was lying flat in the dirt. Pile of something near the water trough that she was fairly certain had been sitting there long enough to become permanent. Laundry on a line that had probably been there since summer, stiff and forgotten. A man appeared in the doorway of the barn. Then another behind him. By the time Whit pulled the wagon to a stop, there were 4 of them standing in the yard, watching her climb down, and she could feel the weight of their collective uncertainty, like a physical thing pressing against her. She didn't wait for introductions. She reached into the back of the wagon, lifted her canvas sack, settled it over her shoulder, and looked at the nearest man. "Is there a kitchen in this house?" He blinked. "Yes, ma'am." "Good. I need a lamp, whatever you have available for cooking, and someone to show me where things are stored." She looked past him toward the house. "After that, I need to not be disturbed for approximately 1 hour. Can someone manage that?" There was a long pause. Then the man who had blinked said, "I can manage that." She nodded and walked toward the front door without waiting for anyone to lead her. Inside, the kitchen was worse than she'd imagined and better than she'd feared. The stove was good old, but well made, the kind that held heat properly when fed correctly. Problem was that it hadn't been fed correctly in some time. She could smell it, the particular stale char smell of a stove that had been running hot and dirty and hadn't been cleaned properly in weeks. The shelves were disorganized in the specific way of men who had been reaching for things without putting them back. Sacks at angles, tins with their labels facing different directions. A Dutch oven sitting on the wrong shelf with its lid beside it, not on it. She found flour, salt, dried beans that were still good, and 4 smoked ham hocks hanging from a hook near the back window. There were onions, a half-full jar of lard, coffee beans. Put on the coffee first, because that was strategic. Men who smelled coffee became easier to manage, and then she began. An hour and 20 minutes later, she set a pot of bean soup with ham, a plate of pan bread, and a fresh pot of coffee on the long table in the main room. 6 men sat down to eat, and for about 4 minutes the only sounds were spoons against bowls and the occasional quiet of someone who had stopped chewing to just experience what was happening. Whit Calder, at the end of the table, ate without looking up. He didn't compliment the food. He didn't say anything at all. When he finished, he refilled his bowl without being asked, and that was the only commentary that mattered. Eliza ate standing at the kitchen counter, which she preferred. She was watching the room, watching the men, learning the shape of what she'd walked into. all within a decade of each other in age, all carrying the same jaw and the same tendency to communicate more in glances than words. The youngest looked barely 20. The second youngest had a laugh that seemed to surprise even him when it happened, like he'd forgotten it was something he still did. None of them looked at her the way she'd been braced for. They looked at her the way people look at a practical solution to a problem with something between gratitude and wariness, which was exactly the right response, she thought. It meant they weren't stupid. She washed the dishes herself. Then she found the broom and swept the kitchen floor. Then she took stock of what was in the larder against what would need to happen in the morning. She was making a list in her head, a ranked list, organized by urgency, when Whit appeared in the kitchen doorway. "There's a back room," he said. "It was my mother's sewing room. Got a cot in it." She looked at him. "I'll sleep in the kitchen. The kitchen floor is cold. I've slept on cold floors before." He didn't push it. Another thing she filed away. "All right," he said. "Morning starts early here. I'll be up before you are," she said, not boastfully, just as a statement of logistics. She had always slept light. It was a thing that had developed over years, and she had long since stopped expecting it to change. He nodded once and left. She stood alone in the kitchen, listening to the house settle around her. Somewheres in the walls, a mouse was considering options. The stove was clicking as it cooled. Outside, wind moved through something, a loose shutter, maybe, or the section of fence she'd noticed on the way in. She set her canvas sack in the corner, folded her coat for a pillow, and lay down fully dressed on the rug near the stove. She lay there for a while, with her eyes open in the dark, listening to the house breathe. She was alive. She had a dime's worth of coffee inside her, a meal she'd cooked herself, and a roof over her head that nobody had offered her out of pity. It wasn't much. But it was hers, at least until the week ran out, and she had survived long enough on smaller things than this to know how to make a week stretch. Closed her eyes. The mouse in the walls made a decision and went still. The wind kept moving through whatever it had found outside. And Eliza Mercer, who had been told by one man what she was worth and had decided he was wrong, fell asleep in a strange kitchen, in a strange house on the edge of a frontier that didn't yet know her name. She was up at 4:30, not because anyone told her to be, and not because she'd slept well, she hadn't. Not really. The unfamiliar sounds of the house, keeping her in that shallow place between sleep and waking, where the mind never fully lets go. But 4:30 was when she always woke, had woken for years, her body having made the decision long ago that the dark hours before dawn were hers and hers alone, the one part of the day that belonged to no one else. Built the fire in the stove before she did anything else. She did it quietly, the way she'd learned to do everything in the years of her marriage, without noise, without announcement, without giving anyone a reason to comment on what she was doing or why. The wood catch was low, which she noted. Someone would need to split more before the week was out. She filed it away. She found cornmeal on the back shelf behind a sack of flour that had been improperly tied and was losing itself slowly to the air. She tied it properly. Then she started the porridge, slow and low, the way it needed to go to be worth eating, and put the coffee on beside it, and stood at the kitchen window in the dark, watching nothing in particular while both things worked. The first brother to appear was the youngest, barely 20, she'd guessed, and she'd guessed right. Came into the kitchen in his sock, feet holding his boots in one hand, clearly expecting the room to be empty, and stopped dead when he saw her standing at the stove. "Morning," she said, without turning around. A pause. "Morning." He pulled out a chair and sat and started working his boots on. "Coffee ready?" 5 minutes. He nodded. He had a name she hadn't caught the night before. She'd been too busy assessing the room to collect names in the right order. "What's your name?" she asked. "Cal," he said. "Calder. Calvin. But nobody calls me that except Whit when I've done something wrong. How often does that happen?" He grinned at the back of her head, probably not realizing she could see the reflection of it in the dark window glass. Often enough. The porridge was ready before the coffee was. She set a bowl in front of him, and he looked at it the way people look at something they weren't expecting to feel moved by. We haven't had porridge since, he stopped. Since your mother, she said. He didn't answer that. He just picked up the spoon. She poured the coffee when it was ready, and by then 2 more brothers had appeared. Hale, who was broad through the shoulders and said almost nothing, and a man called Dix, who talked enough to cover for both himself and Hale, and seemed to be aware of this, and unapologetic about it. They ate without ceremony, the way working men eat when they have somewhere to be, efficiently and without waste. Whit came in last, already dressed for the day, hat in hand. He looked at the pot on the stove, looked at his brothers at the table, and then looked at Eliza. You didn't have to start this early, he said. I know I didn't, she said, and handed him a cup. Took it. He sat. He didn't say anything else about it, which was the right response. The remaining 2 brothers arrived in a cluster twins, she realized, identical enough to be disorienting, named Remy and Cole, who she immediately decided she would distinguish by other means since their faces were going to be useless for that purpose, for at least a week. One of them was left-handed. That would do. 6 men around a table, eating hot food in the early morning dark, and the kitchen smelled like coffee and wood smoke, and something that was almost, if you were generous about it, like a house that had people in it who were taking care of each other. Smoke. Eliza stood at the counter and drank her own coffee and did not let herself feel anything particular about that observation. The first 3 days were about learning the shape of the place. She was systematic about it in a way she didn't announce. She moved through the house room by room during the hours when the brothers were out working, not snooping. She wasn't interested in their private things, but cataloging what was broken and what needed attention, and what had simply been neglected past the point of noticing. There was a remarkable amount in that third category. The slow drift of a household without anyone managing it was a particular kind of erosion, she knew. It didn't announce itself. It just accumulated, one small failing at a time, until one day you looked around, and nothing was quite right, and you couldn't remember how it had gotten that way. The broken coffee grinder was the first thing she fixed. It had a cracked wooden handle and a gear that had slipped its housing, which was why it had been abandoned on the shelf, with beans being crushed inadequately between 2 flat stones instead. She found the gear, seated it correctly with a piece of soft wire she stripped from a coil in the barn, wrapped the handle crack tight with waxed thread from her own kit, and put it back on the shelf. When Dix came in that afternoon and saw it, he picked it up and turned it over in his hands the way you turn something over when you're trying to understand it. How'd you fix this? He said. Carefully, she said. He laughed the short, involuntary kind. Whit said you were a cook. I'm a cook, she agreed. I'm also a person who finds it difficult to walk past something that's broken when I know how to fix it. He set it back on the shelf and looked at her for a moment, with something she couldn't quite categorize, not suspicion exactly, but its close neighbor. Most people who come through here want something, he said. Not saying you're most people, just saying. Most people who come through here are probably hungry, she said. Same as me. The difference is how you go about it. He chewed on that for a moment, then nodded slowly and went back outside. She fixed the coffee grinder on a Monday. By Wednesday, she had mended 3 shirts and a pair of work trousers left in a pile on the bench near the back door that had apparently been there for weeks in a state of waiting. She rehung a kitchen cabinet door that had been listing sideways on a loose hinge. Using a she straightened herself from a bent one she found in the drawer. She cleaned the stove properly, a job that required 2 hours, and left her hands black to the wrist, and her arms aching from the scrubbing. And when she was done it, drew heat the way it was supposed to, and stopped making the choking smell that had been part of the kitchen's atmosphere like bad weather. The meals improved in proportion to her understanding of what was available. She made a proper bread on the 3rd day, the kind that took time and couldn't be rushed, and when she pulled it from the oven, the smell of it moved through the whole house, and she heard, from somewhere outside, someone stop walking. The bread was not perfect, She'd used slightly too much salt because the salt crock in this kitchen was different than the one she was used to, and her hand had misjudged. She knew it before she tasted it, but it was good bread, honestly good, and the fact that it wasn't flawless made it more honest somehow. Hale, the quiet, broad-shouldered one, ate 3 slices without comment. That was his version of a standing ovation. What she hadn't expected was the mending. Not the shirts, not the trousers those she'd anticipated. What she hadn't anticipated was Cal appearing at the kitchen doorway on the 4th morning holding a jacket with an expression that a 20-year-old man gets when he needs to ask for something and isn't sure how. "This was my mother's stitching," he said, holding it out. A seam had come apart along the left shoulder, the thread dried out and brittle from age. "I don't know if you can sit down," she said. "Leave it with me." He set the jacket on the counter carefully, the way you set down something you're afraid of damaging further, and left without another word. She worked on the jacket that evening. After supper at the kitchen table with the lamp pulled close. The original stitching was fine work small, even the kind of stitching that takes patience and a steady hand. She matched the thread from her kit as closely as she could, a warm brown that wasn't quite right, but was close enough that you wouldn't see the difference unless you were looking for it. She used the same stitch, tight and flat. She spent 40 minutes on a seam that covered 3 inches. When she gave it back to Cal the next morning, he held it up to the light and ran his thumb along the repair, and didn't say anything for a moment. "She'd have done it the same way," he finally said. "I don't know how she'd have done it," Eliza said honestly. "I just did it the way I know." He folded the jacket over his arm and walked out, and she turned back to the stove and didn't make anything of it, which was the right thing to do. But she stood at the stove for a moment, longer than necessary, her hands resting on the edge of the warm iron. And there was something in her chest that she recognized as the particular ache of a thing, almost trusted the feeling of someone coming close enough to let you help them, when help is the thing you have most to give. She pushed it down and started breakfast. The brothers were not easy people. She hadn't expected them to be. Men who worked the land in hard country developed a density to them, not coldness, exactly, but a compactness, an economy of expression that could look like coldness if you weren't reading it correctly. They didn't talk about their feelings because their feelings were large and inconvenient, and there was always work to be done. They showed things in other ways. Hale started leaving the woodbox full before she could note that it was getting low. She never asked him to. He simply noticed that she was checking it in the morning and made the checking unnecessary. He did this without comment or acknowledgement, the same way he did most things. Dix, who talked constantly about almost everything, never asked her a single personal question. She recognized this as a form of respect from a man who was curious enough to ask 10 questions a minute. He gave her the courtesy of not prying, and she gave him the courtesy of not commenting on the restraint it must have cost him. Remy, the left-handed twin, had a habit of appearing in the kitchen doorway in the late afternoon and asking if anything needed carrying or moving. He asked every day. She found things for him to do most days, not because she needed him specifically, but because she understood that offering to help was his way of building something, and she wasn't going to refuse someone the chance to build. Cole, the right-handed twin, played a battered harmonica in the evenings on the front step. He wasn't particularly good at it, but he played anyway, and the music imperfect and slightly mournful in the particular way harmonica music gets when played by someone who is mostly self-taught, moved through the house like a kind of presence. She didn't tell him she liked it, but one evening she left the front window unlatched, and the sound came in better, and she worked in the kitchen with it moving around her, and said nothing to anyone about why the window was open. And then there was Whit. Whit was the most complicated, which she'd guessed from the first night. He was the oldest, which meant he'd been carrying the weight of this place the longest. He was also the one who'd made the decision to bring her here, and she understood without being told that that decision had cost him something, some kind of pride, or principle, or the specific resistance that people develop when they've been managing alone long enough that asking for help feels like failure. He treated her with a careful correctness that she recognized as a man making an ongoing effort. He said, "Good morning." He said thank you. After meals, not elaborately, just the words plainly, which was enough. He didn't give her orders. He gave her information and let her make her own decisions about what to do with it. That was more than she'd expected. But he also watched her. Not intrusively, she'd have shut that down immediately, but with the peripheral attention of someone who was still deciding whether to trust something. She understood it. She was doing the same thing to him. On the fifth evening, she was sitting at the kitchen table after supper with the account book she'd found in the kitchen drawer, going through what remained of the household stores and making notes about what needed to be sourced before winter. She wasn't going to bring it up unless he asked. It wasn't her place to volunteer information about his finances, and she was almost certain he already knew most of what she was looking at. He appeared in the kitchen doorway around 8 o'clock, which was later than his usual pattern. "You don't have to do that," he said, looking at the account book. "I know I don't," she said. She didn't close it. "I found it in the drawer. I wanted to understand what I was working with." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the table rather than at her. "It's not as bad as it looks. It's not as bad as it could be," she agreed. "Your flour situation is the most urgent. The salt, too. The smoked meat will last you into December if nothing else changes. Your lard situation is fine." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, which she hadn't expected. He looked at the book, the way people look at things that are true and inconvenient. "I've been meaning to get to town," he said. "Before or after the fence on the north side?" He looked up at her then. A straight look, direct. "You noticed the north fence. I notice most things," she said. "It's a habit I developed because it's useful. I'm not saying it to be impressive. I didn't think you were." He was quiet again. He had a way of being quiet. That wasn't uncomfortable. It wasn't the silence of someone who'd run out of things to say. It was the silence of someone who was actually thinking. She found it easier to be around than the kind of quiet that needed filling. "The north fence is 3 days' work at least," he said. "Town has to wait until it's done. Winter comes early here. I know. I can manage without the flour for another week if I'm careful about what I make." She closed the account book. "I just thought you should know what the timeline looks like from the kitchen side." He nodded. He didn't thank her for this, which was the right instinct. Thanking her would have made it smaller than it was, would have turned it into a favor rather than what it actually was, which was two people thinking about the same problem from different angles. He stood up. "The week's almost done," he said. She looked up at him. "I know. You planning to tell me what you think? About staying on?" She thought about it for a moment, not because she didn't know the answer, but because she wanted to be honest about the answer rather than convenient. "I think this place needs what I can do," she said, "and I think you know that. The question is whether you can live with someone else knowing it too." He looked at her for a long time. Then something in the set of his jaw shifted, just slightly, not softening exactly, more like the release of something held too long. "Same pay," he said. "For now." "Fine," she said. He left. She sat with the closed account book in front of her and let herself feel, for exactly 3 seconds, the small and private satisfaction of knowing she had somewhere to be in the morning. Then she put the account book back in the drawer and went to check the stove. The trouble with dust halo had been building for longer than anyone cared to calculate. Eliza had been aware of it from the beginning. You heard things in kitchens and at bar counters and along the edges of conversations that people assumed she wasn't tracking, but it became concrete on the morning of her 6th day at the ranch, when a man rode up fast from the direction of town and tied his horse to the rail outside with the particular urgency of someone who'd been moving as fast as they could and still felt they were too slow. His name was Arlen Bott. He was a small rancher, she gathered, with a place 2 miles south of the Calders, and a face that carried the particular wear of a man who had been quietly frightened for a long time. Whit met him outside. Eliza could hear the conversation from the kitchen window, which she was not going to apologize for because the window was already open for ventilation, and it wasn't her fault that sound carried. He's raising the rate again, Arlen said. He meant Chet Dolan. She knew the name already. Dolan's name moved through every conversation about this county, the way a stone moves through a boot, felt even when you weren't looking at it. Third time since spring. Says it's for maintenance. Says the well's costing him more to run. Is it? Whit said. Course it's not. Arlen's voice had a tremor in it that wasn't quite anger. It was the sound of a man who'd been afraid long enough that the anger underneath it had worn a little thin. He's got a lock on the only reliable water for 12 miles in every direction, and he knows it. There's nothing to stop him from raising it again next month, and the month after that, and every month after that until people start selling off or giving up, which is exactly what he wants. A long pause from outside. She heard Whit shift his weight. She'd learned the sound of it. The slight creak of the boards where he usually stood when he was thinking hard about something he didn't want to say. I'll talk to the others, he said finally. See if there's something we can do together that we can't do alone. We've been saying that for 6 months, Arlen said. I know, Dolan knows it too. Arlen's voice dropped. He's not afraid of any of us, Whit. That's the problem. He's not afraid of any of us because he doesn't have to be. She heard Arlen mount up and leave. She heard Whit stand outside for a while before he came back in. He didn't come to the kitchen. She heard him in the main room, the sound of the chair at the desk, papers moving. She made coffee and set a cup on the desk without comment and went back to the kitchen, and he didn't acknowledge it, which was fine. He was working through something, and she wasn't going to interrupt it. She stood at the kitchen counter and thought about Chet Dolan. She knew men like Dolan. She had lived in proximity to one. What made them dangerous wasn't cruelty, though they were capable of it. It was the patience, the way they constructed dependency, and then waited for the dependency to do their work for them. Dolan hadn't built that well monopoly in a week. He'd taken years, buying up water rights quietly, one at a time, until one day the people around him looked up and discovered they'd been slowly surrounded without anyone ever drawing a weapon. The thing about that kind of power was that it looked unassailable from the inside. When you were already dependent on someone, already paying their rate, and already afraid of what happened if you stopped, it felt like the situation was permanent, like it had always been this way and would always be this way. But permanent was almost never the right word for it. What it usually meant was nobody had found the other way yet. Put the thought away and turned back to the noon meal. The 7th day came and went without ceremony. She'd been prepared for the conversation about whether she was staying. Whit had essentially already had it with her at the kitchen table, but there was a small part of her that had been quietly tensed for the morning of the 8th day in the way. Brace for news. You think you know, but don't fully trust yet. 8th morning came. Nobody said anything about her leaving. Cal ate his porridge. Hale filled the woodbox. Dix talked about the condition of a horse's left rear hoof for 11 minutes without pause. Remy asked if anything needed carrying. Cole played 3 bars of a new melody on his harmonica that evening before losing the thread of it and starting over. She was still here. That was the whole of it. On the 8th evening, after supper, she was in the kitchen when she heard something from the back of the house, a sound she couldn't immediately place, rhythmic and effortful, like men working. She left the kitchen and walked down the narrow back hallway toward the sewing room that Whit had mentioned. Her first night, the room with the cot. The door was closed. The sounds were coming from inside it. She almost knocked. Instead, she stood in the hall for a moment, listening to the sounds, the scrape of furniture being moved, the particular grunt of lifting something heavy, the lower register of 2 or 3 people working together, in a space that wasn't quite big enough for all of them and understood, in a way that moved through her slowly and with unexpected force, what she was hearing. She went back to the kitchen. She finished the dishes. She dried her hands on the towel hanging from the oven handle and looked out the dark kitchen window for a while. She did not cry. She hadn't cried in a long time, not since the road after Dolan's men came, when she'd sat in a ditch for 20 minutes and let herself do it once, thoroughly. because she knew she wouldn't be able to again for a while. She did not cry now, but something in her chest did a thing that wasn't quite crying, a loosening, a small and private giving way, like a door in a room she'd kept shut, beginning to open slightly on its own. She wasn't going to look in that room tonight. Whatever was in there could wait. She had learned that wanting something and moving carefully toward it were the same motion. If you were patient enough. She turned off the lamp and lay down on her kitchen rug, fully dressed, coat folded under her head. The harmonica from the front step played something slow and only slightly wrong. She listened to it until she couldn't anymore. The 9th morning was a Thursday. She knew it was Thursday because Cal had mentioned on Wednesday that Thursday was when the feed supplier came through from Laramie, which meant at least 2 of the brothers would be occupied at the south end of the property most of the day. She'd used that information to plan the noon meal accordingly, something that held well and could be eaten in shifts. She was out at the well before 6, drawing water for the kitchen, when she noticed that the line pressure was wrong. It was a small thing. The water came so slower than it should have, and when it came, it ran slightly cloudy for the first several seconds before clearing. She drew 2 full buckets and carried them back to the kitchen and set them down and stood looking at them. Cloudy water from a line that had been running clear for 8 days meant something had disturbed the line. Tree root, animal, seasonal shift, or something else. She drew another bucket an hour later. Still slow, still slightly off. She didn't say anything about it yet. She needed more information before she could say anything useful, and she had long since learned the difference between raising an alarm and raising a problem you understood well enough to also offer a direction for. She spent the morning cooking and watching the sky. By early afternoon, Whit came in from the north fence work with his hands raw from the cold and a set to his shoulders that told her the fence was going slower than he wanted. He set food in front of him and refilled his coffee without asking, and then sat down across the table from him, which she almost never did. He looked up. "The water line's running slow," she said, "and cloudy. Since this morning." He was very still for a moment. How cloudy. Clearing after a few seconds, but slow, distinctly slow. He set down his fork. He looked at the cup in his hands instead of at her, and in his face, she watched the calculation happening, the quick, running account of what slow and cloudy water meant at this time of year, in this stretch of the season, on a ranch with cattle that would need that water when the temperature climbed in the coming days. Could be natural, he said. It wasn't hope. It was the statement of a man checking whether a door was locked before he assumed it was. It could be, she agreed. But you should check the line before the end of the day. He stood up without finishing his meal. She watched him go out the back door and thought about Chet Dolan, who had come into her kitchen without knocking, with papers in his hand and 6 men outside, had given her until sundown. She thought about how Dolan operated not with violence first, because violence was messy and attracted attention. First came the pressure. First came the slow tightening of something essential, the quiet removal of what people needed most, until the need itself became the weapon. Picked up Whit's unfinished plate and carried it to the counter, and stood there looking at the cloudy water in the bucket by the door. Could be natural. But Eliza Mercer had been alive on this earth for 31 years, and she had learned, in ways both small and severe, that the things that happened right when you'd finally found somewhere to stand were almost never accidents. Whit came back inside 40 minutes later with mud on his boots and an expression that answered the question. Before he said a word, she was at the stove. She didn't turn around. Immediately she gave him the moment to come in, set his hat down, pull out the chair. She'd learned that Whit needed a beat between arriving at bad news and being ready to talk about it. If you pushed before that beat was finished, you got the closed version of him, the one that said it's fine and meant the opposite. She turned around when she heard the chair. "The line's been blocked," he said, "about 60 yards out from the house, where it runs under the old oak. Something packed into the pipe from outside. Rock and clay, pressed in hard. That doesn't happen on its own." She set down the spoon she was holding. How bad is it? Bad enough. I can clear the immediate blockage, take most of tomorrow. The line runs close to the creek for another quarter-mile before it hits the main feed. If someone was willing to do 60 yards, they were willing to do the whole stretch. He looked at the table. I need to walk the whole line before I can tell you what we're actually dealing with. When can you walk it? Tomorrow. First light. He looked up at her then, and there was something in his face that he was working to keep flat, not panic. Whit wasn't a man who panicked, but something's adjacent to it. A controlled version of the fear that comes when you're doing the math, and the math is coming out wrong. Cattle need water, Eliza. 2-3 days without adequate flow in this heat, and we start losing animals. A week, and we lose a significant portion of the herd. She nodded. She was already thinking, had been thinking since the cloudy water this morning, running the shape of the problem forward to see where it went. Does Dolan know your line runs close to the creek? The way he looked at her told her everything. Everybody who's been in this county more than a season knows where our line runs. So he knows. Whit didn't answer that directly, which was its own answer. He put his hands flat on the table and looked at them, big hands, scarred from years of fence wire and ranch work, the kind of hands that could fix most things if given the right material and enough time. Can't prove it was him, he said. And even if I could, taking it to the sheriff in Dust Halo is the same as taking it to Dolan directly. I know, she said, which means I've got no legal option, no water to speak of, and a man in town who's been waiting for exactly this kind of opening. She sat down across from him. She almost never did this, sat at his table in the center of the room, the two of them face to face with the problem between them like a third person. But this was not a kitchen counter conversation. This was the kind of conversation that needed to be level. Tell me about the Eastern Flats, she said. He looked at her. What about them? Past them. What's out there? A pause. His hand shifted on the table. Why? Because I've been listening to you and your brothers talk about this county for 8 days, and 3 different times someone mentioned the Eastern Flats in a way that suggested there was something on the other side of them worth knowing about. And nobody finished the sentence, which means whatever's out there is something people stop talking about, and things people stop talking about are usually things that got taken away or blocked or told into non-existence. She kept her eyes on him. So what's out there? Whit was quiet for a long time. Not the kind of quiet that meant he was stalling, the kind that meant he was making a decision about how much to say. There's a spring, he said finally. Or there was. Eastern Flats, maybe 6 miles out past the second ridge. My father found it when he first settled this land, before the county had been properly mapped. He used it one summer when the creek ran low. He paused. The summer after that, it was gone. Gone how? Blocked. Someone had moved rock and earth over the opening. A lot of rock. Enough that my father spent 2 days looking for the original site before he gave up and decided he'd misremembered the location. Another pause. He hadn't misremembered. How do you know? Because Dolan's father bought the land adjacent to the Eastern Flats the following spring, Whit said. And Chet Dolan sank his first well the spring after that. And within 18 months, the Dolan well was the only reliable water source within 12 miles, and everyone in Dust Halo had made their peace with, depending on it. He looked at her steadily. My father told me about the spring once, when I was maybe 14. Said he thought someone had buried it deliberately. Said he couldn't prove it. Said, and this was the thing that stuck with me, that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do to people is teach them to forget what they once had. Eliza was very still. She was thinking about a road outside a homestead, about a man walking through a door he didn't knock on, about 6 months of a different kind of slow blocking, debt upon debt, pressure upon pressure, the gradual removal of options until the only one left was the one someone else had chosen for you. Do you know where it is? She said. Roughly, his voice had changed. Something in it had shifted, cautious and interested at the same time, like a man who'd been looking at a door for years, and someone had just asked him if he had the key. My father described the terrain to me. I've never been out there myself. Flats are, They're hard going, especially this time of year. The ground does things in cold weather, heaves and drops, in ways that make navigation unreliable. I've navigated unreliable ground before, 6 miles of it, in cold weather, with no guarantee the spring is still there or still reachable. No, she agreed. No guarantee. But you have cattle dying if you do nothing, and a man in town who's been planning this for long enough that the plan was already working before you noticed it. She held his gaze. What's the alternative? He didn't answer right away. She could see him working through it, the practical Whit, the one who managed 6 brothers and a failing ranch and a county that had given him nothing but problems. Running the numbers, checking the exits, confirming that the exits were as limited as they looked. It's a risk, he said. Everything out here is a risk, she said. Question is, which risk you're choosing? She didn't sleep that night. Not because of anxiety. Exactly, anxiety implied uncertainty, and she was past uncertainty. She'd made her assessment of the situation, and the assessment was clear. They were going to the eastern flats, or they were watching the Calder cattle die, while Chet Dolan adjusted his rates and waited for Whit to come to him on his knees. Those were the options. She'd looked at them from every angle she had, and they kept resolving to the same two. What kept her awake was the room. Whit had told her, just before she went to the back of the house, that she might as well sleep in the sewing room tonight. He'd said it the way he said most things, directly, without elaboration, in the tone of a man presenting a fact rather than making an offer. She'd taken the lamp and walked down the hallway and pushed open the door. What was inside stopped her in the frame. They had done it quietly over the past 2 days, while she was in the kitchen, or at the well, or occupied with the 100 small things that kept the house running. She understood now what she'd been hearing those 2 evenings, the movements she'd catalogued and set aside. The cot was gone. In its place was a proper bed frame, solid pine, fitted with the mattress. From she wasn't certain, but she suspected from one of the storage rooms off the barn. The mattress was worn but clean. Someone had beaten it, she could tell, the dust gone out of it. There was a blanket on it, heavy wool, folded at the foot. Beside the bed stood a small table that she had seen in the barn 2 days ago, wedged between a broken plow and a stack of leather scraps, and she had thought it was junk. It was not junk. Someone had cleaned it and set it in here. The window, a single, small window that looked out onto the back of the property, there was a curtain. It was blue, or had been blue once, slightly faded. It hung at a slight angle, the rod not quite level, in the way of something hung by people doing their best with imperfect tools. And on the table, sitting by itself, was an iron key. She stood in the doorway for a long time. She was aware that she needed to go in and set down the lamp and sleep, because tomorrow was going to require everything she had, and she could not afford to stand in doorways having feelings about curtains. She knew this. She stood there anyway. The key was old, the kind that fit a padlock, not a door. The lock was on a small cedar box that she saw now was sitting under the table, the kind of box that held documents or small valuables, kind of thing that said, here is a place where what is yours stays yours, and no one else touches it. She went in. She set the lamp on the table. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the room for a while, the crooked curtain, the rough table, the simple mattress, the key. She had lived in nicer rooms. She had also lived in a house where the nicest rooms still felt like someone else's, where the furniture was technically hers, and the space was technically hers, and the deed had her name on it, and none of it ever felt like anything except borrowed, except temporary, except the kind of arrangement that would eventually be renegotiated by someone with more leverage than she had. This was a crooked curtain and a dented key. It felt more real than anything she'd slept inside in 6 years. She lay down on top of the blanket, fully dressed as always, and closed her eyes. And somewhere between trying not to feel anything about this and failing completely, she fell asleep. She was up before anyone else, which was a standard, but this morning she didn't go to the kitchen first. She walked the line, not the water line that was Whit's work. and she didn't have the technical knowledge to assess it better than he already had. She walked the property line, the eastern edge, in the gray pre-dawn with her coat on and her breath showing in the cold air, reading the terrain the way she'd learned to read it in the years. On the road not as landscape, but as language. The land said things, if you listened to it correctly. It said where the water moved and where it didn't, where the ground was solid and where it heaved, where the old paths were, even if the visible tracks had long since been swallowed by grass. Eastern flats started where the Calder property ended. She could see the beginning of them from the fence line, a long, pale expanse that looked flat from a distance and wasn't. That looked dead from a distance and also wasn't quite. There were grasses, brown, now, and the occasional low scrub. There were ridgelines she could see against the lightening sky, and she was counting them, marking them against what Whit had told her the night before. Past the second ridge. She stood at the fence line for 10 minutes with the cold coming in off the flats and thought about what 6 miles of that terrain meant in time, in effort, in the specific difficulty of moving a group of people through ground that shifted and deceived underfoot. She thought about what they would need. Practically, tools for digging, rope, wood for shoring, if the spring's opening required it. She thought about weather. The sky this morning was clear, but the kind of clear that was its own warning in this season, too bright and too cold. She had the shape of it. Not the certainty she was too practical for certainty, but the shape. She went back to the kitchen and made breakfast. Whit had walked the full water line by noon and come back with confirmation of what they'd both suspected. The blockage wasn't isolated. 3 points along the line, each packed with the same combination of rock and clay, each in a location accessible from the creek bank rather than from the Calder side. 3 points meant someone had planned it, scouted the line before this and identified the vulnerable locations, and then done the work methodically, in the dark, probably, without anyone noticing. He told her at the kitchen table with his brothers around him, because it was the kind of thing that needed to be said to everyone at once. Eliza stood at the counter and listened to the room change as the information settled in. Cal's face went the particular white of a young man, confronting something that exceeds his previous understanding of how far people will go. Dick stopped talking, which had its own weight. Hale made a sound in his chest that wasn't a word, just a sound, low and slow, the kind that meant the anger had arrived, but he was keeping a hand on it. Remy and Cole exchanged the look of twins who'd been finishing each other's thoughts for 20 years and had just arrived at the same destination simultaneously. "He's going to push for a buyout next," Dick said. The sentence came out flat, all the usual animation gone from it. "He'll let us flounder for a week, watch us lose cattle, and then he'll come in with a price and dress it up like he's doing us a favor." "He won't get it," Whit said. "That's not a plan, it's a position," Dick said. "Positions don't water cattle." The table went quiet. It was the harshest thing Dix had said in the 8 days she'd been here, and the fact that it was also completely accurate made the silence heavier. Eliza set her hands on the counter edge and looked at the 6 of them. "I want to tell you something," she said, "and I want you to hear it before you decide anything." All 6 turned toward her. Whit's expression was careful. He'd heard some version of what she was about to say the night before, but he watched her as if he was waiting to see how she was going to say it in front of his brothers. She told them about the spring. She told them what Whit had shared with her, the way his father found it, the way it disappeared, the way the Dolan well appeared the following season. She didn't editorialize. She just laid it out in the order it happened, the way you lay out tools before a job, so you can see what you're working with. When she finished, the room was still. "You think it's still there?" Cal said. "I think it was deliberately buried, which means it wasn't filled in, it was covered. There's a difference." She looked at him steadily. Covered can be uncovered. If the spring itself is intact, if the water table in that area hasn't shifted significantly, we have something to work with. "That's a lot of ifs," Hale said. It was the most words she'd heard him string together since she arrived. "Yes," she agreed. "It is." Another silence. Then Remy, the left-handed one, said, How do you know where to look? I don't, she said. Not exactly. But your father described the terrain to Whit specifically enough that we have a working direction. Past the eastern flats, past the second ridge. I walked the fence line this morning. The terrain is readable. She paused. And I have been reading terrain for long enough that I know when I'm seeing something and when I'm not. You've done this before? Cole asked. He wasn't skeptical exactly more, like someone checking an unfamiliar knot before he trusted his weight to it. I've found water in hard country before, yes, she said. Not a buried spring specifically. But water doesn't hide the way people think it does. It leaves signs. I know what I'm looking for. Dix was watching her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before, focused, stripped of the usual lively surface, the real face underneath. And if you don't find it, then we come back and your brother figures out how to repair the water line, and we all think harder about how to get out from under Dolan's thumb by a different route. She held his gaze. But I think we'll find it. Why? Because Dolan went to the trouble of burying it, she said. And men like Dolan don't go to trouble for things that aren't worth troubling over. They left before dawn the next morning, which meant she had the day before to prepare. She was precise about preparation. Not meticulous to the point of delay, she'd learned that the enemy of a plan was the perfect version of the plan, because perfect plans never left, because they were never finished. She was thorough. She made a list in her head and worked through it without wasted motion. Provisions. She packed enough for 2 days, because she didn't expect it to take 2 days, but she'd rather carry the weight than need what she didn't have. Hard bread, smoked meat, dried apple, coffee in a tight-sealed tin. Water for the journey out, because you didn't cross hard ground, trusting to find water where you expected it. That was how people in this country died, betting on expectations. Tools. Whit decided which brothers were coming himself. Hale, Dix, and Remy, the 4 who were strongest and most practical in difficult conditions. Cal stayed back to watch the cattle and the property, which wounded his pride visibly, and she understood it, but it was the right decision. Cole stayed with Cal for the same reason. The 4 going loaded shovels, 2 pickaxes, a coil of heavy rope, and the wooden shoring planks that Whit had originally cut for a fencing job and had never used. She packed her own small kit, the bone-handled knife, the waxed thread and needles. You never went anywhere without the ability to close a wound, the tin box of herbs, the folded piece of leather that had been managing her boot sole. She'd fixed the boot properly 2 days ago with a strip of better leather she'd found in the barn, and the same waxed thread. She was no longer aware of every pebble underfoot, which mattered more than it might seem when you were going to be walking 6 miles across unstable ground in the cold. That evening, after supper, she sat at the kitchen table with a piece of paper and drew what she was thinking. Not a map. She didn't have enough information for a true map, but a diagram of the relationships between the terrain features Whit had described, where the second ridge sat relative to the flats where the sun would be at different times of day, and what that meant for reading the ground, where a spring would most logically surface given the rock formations she'd observed on her morning walk. Whit came in while she was drawing it and stood behind her for a moment, looking over her shoulder. "Where did you learn to do this?" he said. "Long roads," she said, "and a husband who couldn't navigate worth a damn and got us lost on a route between Kansas and Nebraska for 3 days in October." She kept drawing. "I figured it out because someone had to." He was quiet for a moment. "Then how did he take that?" "Badly," she said. "He always took it badly when I knew something he didn't. And then he always let me do it anyway, because the alternative was staying lost." Feel Whit standing behind her, reading this information the way he read most things slowly, carefully, without comment. She didn't elaborate. Thomas was dead, and the marriage was done, and she didn't owe anyone the details of it, least of all the parts that would make someone else angry on her behalf, which was a kindness she genuinely did not need right now. "Get some sleep," he said finally. "Morning starts at 4. "I know when morning starts," she said. She heard him almost smile. Just the small change in breath that meant it. He left her to the diagram. She worked on it for another half hour, then folded it and put it in her coat pocket and banked the stove for the night, and went down the hall to the room with the crooked blue curtain, stopped in the doorway again. She thought she'd be past the stopping by now, but she wasn't. She looked at the iron key on the table. She picked it up, turned it over, set it back down. She didn't open the cedar box tonight. There would be time for that when they came back. Felt right to leave it like something she was holding for herself. A small future certainty in a situation with very few of them. She lay down, fully dressed. She was always fully dressed. The house was quiet around her. Somewhere down the hall, one of the brothers Cole, she thought, from the particular quality of the silence around him, was also awake. She could feel the wakefulness in the house the way you feel weather before it arrives. Tomorrow was either going to change things or it wasn't. She'd done everything she could think of to make it the former. The rest was terrain and time, and the specific stubbornness that had gotten her out of a ditch 3 counties ago, and onto a wagon bench with a stranger headed to a ranch she'd never seen. Closed her eyes. 4 o'clock came. The kitchen was dark. She had the coffee on before anyone else was up, and the sound of it, and the smell of it, since the smell of it moved through the house like a hand on a shoulder, waking people gently. They ate standing up mostly. Cold meat and the last of the previous day's bread, coffee that was too hot, and all of them drank it anyway. Because the cold outside the house was serious this morning, the kind of cold that suggested the season had made a decision overnight. She checked her coat pocket for the diagram. It was there. Whit looked at her across the kitchen in the early dark. Not a question, more like a confirmation. "Are you ready?" She gave him the same look back. Yes. They went out. The eastern flats in the pre-dawn were something she hadn't been prepared for, despite having stood at their edge the morning before. The scale of them was different in the dark, the darkness compressing and expanding distance in ways that made the first mile feel both shorter and longer than it was. The ground under their boots was hard and cold, and it did the things she'd expected it to do, shifting and dropping in places where subsurface water had moved through in earlier seasons and left the ground above it subtly compromised. She walked at the front, not because she'd asked to, and not because Whit had assigned it. She'd simply moved to the front when they started, and none of the 4 men behind her had questioned it. She was navigating by the diagram in her head, cross-referencing it against the actual terrain. As it revealed itself in the growing light, the angle of the ridgeline to the northeast, the way the grasses grew in particular directions that told her something about where the subsurface water moved, the rock formations that appeared as they crested small rises and told her the story of what was underneath. She made 2 adjustments to her intended path in the first 2 miles. Both times she stopped briefly, looked at what she was seeing, made the correction, and moved on without explanation. Dix asked once why they were angling northeast when she'd said they were heading east-northeast. She told him the ground ahead was reading wrong, and she wanted to come at the second ridge from a different angle. He accepted this, which surprised her slightly. The cold got worse as the light increased, which was sometimes the way of it in this country. By the time they reached the first ridge, all 5 of them were moving with the particular efficiency of people who are cold and intending to stay warm by not stopping. She found the second ridge an hour and 40 minutes into the walk, which was faster than she'd estimated. It was lower than she'd expected, not a dramatic rise, but a long, gradual swell in the terrain, visible when you were looking for it and invisible when you weren't. Crested it and stopped. Below her, the ground changed. She stood on the ridge for a moment, reading what she was seeing. The others came up beside her and looked at what she was looking at, and she could feel their uncertainty. They saw flat ground with rocks, which was most of what flats were, but she was looking at something else. The rock formation at the base of the slope below her was wrong. Not wrong in a way that announced itself, wrong in a way that required knowing what right looked like. The rocks here were a different color than the surrounding terrain, a slightly darker gray that indicated a different mineral composition, which meant a different subsurface structure, which meant this area had a different geological history than what surrounded it. And more importantly, the rocks were too organized. Not arranged by hand. Obviously, this wasn't that deliberate, but grouped and settled in a way that spoke of something having happened here, something having been moved. There, she said, and started down the slope. She heard Whit behind her, a breath, sharp, the sound of recognition. He'd seen it too, or he'd seen that she'd seen something. And his trust in what she was seeing had reached a point where that was enough. They reached the base of the slope. She crouched and put her hand on the rock closest to her. Cold, naturally cold, the deep cold of something that had been sitting out for years. But when she pressed her palm flat against it, after a moment, she felt it not warmth, but the absence of the deep freeze you felt on rocks that had nothing moving beneath them. Trace of something. The faintest differential. She looked up at Hale, who was the strongest of the four. "Start here," she said. "Move it toward me." He looked at the rock. He looked at her. He picked up a shovel. The first rock took 20 minutes because it had settled into the earth on its underside, and they had to break it free before they could move it. The second was faster. By the third, Remy had taken over with the pickaxe, working at the frozen edges of the stone's base, and the four of them had developed a system without being taught one, the particular improvised efficiency of capable men given a direction to move in. Eliza moved along the formation, reading it, pointing to each section, in order. She was looking for where the weight was distributed wrong, where the rocks had been placed, rather than having fallen. Took concentration, and she gave it full concentration, blocking out the cold in the effort and the small part of her mind that was keeping a running account of how bad it would be if she'd read this wrong. She had not read it wrong. She knew it 30 minutes in, when they'd moved enough rock to see the earth beneath the formation clearly, and the earth beneath was darker and more cohesive than the surrounding soil-packed earth, compacted artificially, the kind of compaction that came from weight placed deliberately on top of it over a long period of time. "Someone buried something here," Dick said, looking at the exposed earth. He said it slowly, like a man arriving at something he'd been told, but hadn't believed until he saw it. "Yes," she said. "Start digging." The frozen earth was brutal work. Pickaxes went in first, cracking and loosening the surface layer, and then the shovels, and then more pickaxe when they hit the harder layer beneath. She moved back and let the four of them work. Her job right now was to watch the ground around the edges of where they were digging, reading the way the frost patterns changed as the center of the work area was disrupted. She was watching for the direction the moisture would show, the way it would express itself at the margins as the disturbance in the center released what was beneath it. She saw it at the eastern edge of the excavation, in a shadow between two rocks she hadn't moved. Dark line, a seam of moisture, dark against the pale frozen soil, spreading outward from the center as slowly and certainly as something alive. "Stop," she said. They stopped. Four men, breathing hard in the cold air, standing in a rough hole in the eastern flats of Dust Halo County with shovels in their hands, looking at her. She crouched at the dark seam and pressed her fingers into the ground beside it. Not damp. Wet, she looked up. "It's here," she said. The four brothers looked at each other, and then back at her, and then at the ground. The seam was spreading. Slowly, the way things that have been held back for a long time move when the thing holding them is finally removed. Not a rush, not a flood, just the quiet and relentless motion of something that had been waiting for a very long time to go where it had always been trying to go. Whit crouched beside her and put his own hand in the ground. Felt him go still. He didn't say anything for a moment. He looked at the moisture spreading outward from the center of the excavation, and she watched him calculate what this meant for the ranch, for the cattle, for the winter ahead, for the man in Dust Halo who had spent years building a structure of dependence on the certainty that this water didn't exist. "How long to open it properly?" he said. "Rest of today most likely," she said. "Maybe into the night if the frozen layer goes deeper than it looks." He nodded. He stood up and looked at his brothers. "Keep digging," he said. They kept digging. Eliza moved to the edge of the work area and sat on a flat rock and let herself feel, for one private moment, the full weight of what was happening. Not triumph, it was too early for that, and she was too careful a person to trust triumph before the thing was finished. Something. The particular sensation of a calculation that has been running in the back of your mind for days finally arriving at an answer, and the answer turning out to be the one you'd hoped for, but hadn't fully allowed yourself to believe in. She let herself feel it for exactly one moment. Then she stood up, walked back to the excavation, and got to work. The frozen layer went deeper than it looked. She'd suspected it might, had said as much to Whit when she estimated the timeline, but suspecting a thing and meeting it in the ground with a pickaxe in your hand were different experiences. By midday they had gone down nearly 3 feet, and the earth was still fighting them, not impossible. Not the kind of ground that was going to stop 5 people who had a reason to keep going, but hard enough that every hour of it was felt in the shoulders and the lower back and the particular place behind the knees that told you how much you'd been asking of your legs. She worked alongside the brothers. She hadn't planned to. She'd intended to stay at the edges reading the ground and directing the excavation. But around mid-morning, when Hale needed to stop and work the cramp out of his right hand, and Dix was breathing harder than he should have been, she picked up the second pickaxe and went to work. Nobody said anything about it. Whit glanced at her once and looked away, and she read the glance correctly, not surprise exactly. More like adjustment, a man revising an assumption he hadn't realized he was carrying. She didn't note it aloud. She swung the pickaxe. The cold was serious and consistent, the kind that didn't fluctuate, but simply sat at a fixed point, somewhere below comfortable, and stayed there. She was warm from the work, her coat open, her sleeves pushed to the elbow, but when she stopped moving, even for a minute, the cold pressed back in immediately, reminding her that it was more patient than she was. They ate at midday, standing at the edge of the excavation. Hard bread and smoked meat, passing the water canteen between them. Nobody talked much, the kind of silence that settles over people who are working toward the same thing, and don't have energy to spare for conversation. She noticed that Dix, who normally would have filled any silence reflexively, ate without speaking, and stared at the hole in the ground with an expression that was somewhere between exhaustion and something more complicated, the look of a man confronting the fact that something he'd been told was impossible was turning out to be merely very difficult. "How much deeper?" Remy asked. He was looking at the excavation floor, where the dark, damp soil was clearly differentiated from what surrounded it now. "Not much," she said. "The moisture's coming from below 4 feet, I think. Maybe 4.5. She looked at where the seam of wet earth ran. "The cap layer is the problem. Once we're through it, the spring does the rest." "What if the opening is narrow?" Hale said. "Then we make it wider." She said it without drama. Because it wasn't drama, it was just the next step. Hale nodded, apparently satisfied with this. He picked up his shovel and went back to work. She watched him for a moment and thought, this is what it looks like when people trust you, not when they say they trust you. When they just go back to work because you told them the next step and they believed you knew what it was. She picked up her pickaxe and followed him in. Cap broke at 3 in the afternoon. It didn't announce itself dramatically. There was no great crack, no rush of sound. Remy was working the eastern edge of the floor with the flat of his shovel when the tool went through, suddenly dropping 6 inches more than expected, and he stumbled forward and caught himself on his knees and looked down at what his shovel had broken into. Dark, wet earth giving way to something beneath it. A void. Small, maybe 8 inches across where the tool had gone through, but a void open space below the surface. And from that open space, even in the cold above-ground air, there rose the particular smell of moving water. Not stagnant, not still, moving. "Don't put weight on it," she said immediately, already moving toward him. "Get back." Remy scrambled backward on his hands and knees. crouched at the edge of the breakthrough, and looked down. The hole was too small to see into clearly, but she could hear it now faint, almost below hearing, the sound of water over stone somewhere beneath them. She looked up at Whit, the shoring planks. He had them moving before she finished the sentence. Brought the planks for exactly this contingency, and she was grateful now for the fact that she'd put them on the list without being certain they'd need them, grateful, and also aware that if she hadn't, they'd have been in a different and worse situation right now. With a breakthrough, they couldn't safely expand because the edges weren't supported, and the frozen earth around the cap would shift unpredictably once the void beneath was open. They worked the planks into position carefully, the four brothers following her direction. She told them where each plank went, how to angle it, how to drive the support stakes she'd had them cut before dawn from the fence posts she'd found behind the barn. It wasn't elegant work. The ground was uncooperative, the cold making everything more difficult, and twice the positioning was wrong and had to be redone. She didn't pretend otherwise. She said, "This isn't right. We need to move it," and they moved it. Without complaint, without the friction that came from people who couldn't tolerate admitting a mistake in the middle of a job. When the shoring was in, she got on her knees at the edge of the opening and used the pickaxe handle to expand the breakthrough carefully, not breaking new ground aggressively, but coaxing the cap apart, following the line of least resistance, letting the void's own shape tell her where it wanted to open. The second breakthrough was larger, 1.5 feet across, and this time the sound was unmistakable water, moving, real water under real pressure, not the slow seep of a shallow aquifer, but the voice of something with depth behind it, something fed from far below where the cold reached. She sat back on her heels. The 5 of them crouched around the opening in the ground and listened to it, and none of them spoke for a moment. Then Dix said quietly, "Well, I'll be. Don't celebrate yet," she said. "We still have to open it enough to be useful and run a line from here to the property." "This is step 1, I know," Dix said. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the opening. But still, I'll be. She understood the feeling. She was having it herself in the private interior, where she kept things she didn't put on her face. Specific satisfaction of having looked at a problem that everyone else had decided was permanent and finding the place where it was only held in place by weight and removing the weight. Stood up. "Keep expanding the opening," she said. "Follow the shoring pattern. When it's wide enough for a bucket, we test the flow and see what we're actually working with." They worked for another 2 hours. The temperature dropped as the afternoon moved toward evening, and she was genuinely cold now despite the work, her fingers less reliable than she needed them to be, the kind of cold that crept past effort and settled in the joints. Kept working. Everyone kept working. When the opening was wide enough, Whit lowered the tin bucket on the rope, and they waited. Came back up full, not slowly full, the way a bucket came up from a well with real depth behind it, heavy and immediate. The water that came over the rim when he tilted it was clear, cold and clear, the specific clarity of water that had been moving through rock for a long time. Whit held the bucket for a moment, just held it. She watched him look at the water in it, and she watched his face do something she hadn't seen it do before, a letting go, brief and controlled, a man allowing himself one unguarded moment with a thing he'd been afraid of losing. He handed the bucket to Hale, who drank from it without ceremony. Remy next, then Dix, then Cal. No, Cal wasn't here. Cal was back at the ranch. Counted wrong. The bucket came to her last. She drank. The water was so cold it hurt. It was the best thing she'd tasted in years. They stayed through what remained of the afternoon and into the early evening, not because she'd planned to, but because the work required it. The opening needed to be properly secured before they left it unsupported. Overnight in frozen ground was a risk she wasn't willing to take. Cap material around the edges unstable, enough that a hard frost could shift it and close the opening again, or worse, collapse it in a way that would make it harder to reopen. She directed the shoring work, and Whit did the bracing, and between them, They developed a shorthand that was almost wordless. She pointed. He assessed. They made small adjustments. Moved on. It was the kind of working together that normally took months to develop, and they'd arrived at it in an afternoon over a hole in the ground, which she noted without making anything of it. Sky went dark fast, the way it did in this country when the season was in earnest about itself. She had a lamp. She'd packed one, because she packed for what she couldn't predict. She lit it and hung it on the rope from the shoring stake, and it threw a small, warm circle of light over the work area, and the five of them moved in and out of it, their breaths showing, the sound of the water below them, a constant low presence. By the time they finished the securing work, it was full dark and genuinely cold in the way that made the 6 miles back across the flats a serious consideration. "We should move," Whit said. He wasn't asking, he was stating the obvious and watching to see if anyone had a reason to contradict it. She looked at the secured opening, the planks set and braced, the ground around it marked with stones she'd arranged to make the location findable in daylight without requiring a specific memory. She looked at the way the water sound came up through the earth, clear and steady, patient as something that had been waiting a long time, and now had no reason to rush. Go. The walk back was harder than the walk out. That was always the way. The going out had the energy of intention behind it, and the coming back had only the weight of what you'd spent. She was tired in a way that went past her muscles into something deeper, the kind of tired that came from sustained focus over a long day in difficult conditions. Her legs were reliable but not enthusiastic. She was aware of every footfall on the uneven ground, in a way that required more attention than it had this morning. She walked at the front again. The lamp threw a small amount of light ahead of them, and she used it carefully, picking the path back the way she'd noted it on the way out, the landmarks, the terrain features, the angle of the ridgeline against the night sky. Cold was worse in the dark, or felt worse, the wind picking up off the flats with nothing to slow it. Nobody talked much. Dix, after the first mile, began to talk, a little, which she took as a good sign, the fact that he was recovering the energy, for it meant they were all right. Talked about nothing in particular, which was his usual mode, just words to fill the dark and the cold, and she found she was glad for it. The harmonica would have been better, but Dick's talking was. She made one navigational correction around the 3rd mile, when the terrain was doing the thing she'd predicted it would do at night, compressing distances, flattening distinctions that were clear in daylight. She stopped, looked at the sky, found the reference point she needed, adjusted the direction, and moved on. Whit, behind her, said nothing. They reached the ranch property at what she estimated was around 9 o'clock. The windows of the house were lit, which meant Cal and Cole had kept the lamps going, and the sight of those lit windows against the dark was something she hadn't expected to feel anything about, and found she felt a great deal about. Cal met them at the door with an expression that had been holding anxiety in place for hours and was ready to put it down. "Well," he said. "It's there," Whit said. Cal looked past him at Eliza. She nodded. "It's there. We've got real work ahead to make it usable, but the spring is intact and the flow is good. Few days more work, and you'll have water that doesn't run through Chet Dolan." Cal let out a breath that had apparently been waiting in him since morning. The next morning brought 2 things she hadn't expected. The first was her body, which registered its full objection to the previous day in the specific language of shoulders that had swung a pickaxe for 6 hours in frozen air, knees that had been on rocky ground multiple times, and hands that were deeply unhappy about the cold they'd been subjected to. She was up at 4:30, as always, and moving, which helped. The movement working, some of the stiffness out, but not all of it. She made breakfast with deliberate, careful motions, and told herself the ache was honest and earned, and that was all there was to say about it. The second unexpected thing arrived at 7:30 in the form of Arlen Bott, who rode up to the ranch not fast this time but slow, with 2 other men behind him she didn't know. She was in the kitchen. She heard the horses and looked out the window and watched Whit go out to meet them. She put on more coffee and waited. Whit brought them inside after a few minutes. Arlen, who she'd seen only in profile through a window, was a smaller man than she'd imagined from his voice, wiry and weathered in the way of men who'd been outside in hard country for too long, with eyes that moved quickly around a room in the manner of someone used to assessing situations before committing to them. The two men with him were brothers, she guessed from their faces. Ranchers. The look of men who'd been carrying something heavy for a while. Poured coffee. She set it on the table and moved back to the counter without making a production of it. Word got around, Arlen said. He was looking at Whit, but she understood it was partly for her benefit. Don't ask me how, people talk. About what, specifically, Whit said. About someone going out to the Eastern Flats yesterday. Arlen wrapped both hands around his coffee cup the way she had in the Dust Halo Saloon 3 weeks ago, and she recognized it the gesture of someone cold for a long time absorbing available warmth. About there maybe being water out there. Who told you? Doesn't matter who told me. Arlen set his cup down. True? A pause. Whit looked at her for a brief moment, not asking permission, more like acknowledging that this was partly hers to answer. It's true, she said from the counter. All three visitors turned to look at her. Arlen's eyes did the quick movement again, assessing, landing, deciding something. A woman found it, he said. It wasn't a criticism, and it wasn't a compliment. It was a man cataloging a fact that didn't fit his expectation and trying to figure out what to do with it. A woman found it, she agreed. Mostly because nobody told me it was impossible, and the men who had been told that were decent enough to come along anyway. One of the brothers almost smiled. Arlen looked at his coffee. What does it take to open it properly? He said. So it's usable. So there's enough flow for more than one ranch. More hands, she said. Better equipment than what we had yesterday. And someone needs to think through the routing before we start running lines, because doing it wrong the first time wastes effort that nobody has to spare. We can bring hands, Arlen said, and equipment. How many people know about this? Whit said. By this afternoon. Everyone in Dust Halo. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. She could feel the weight of that, what it meant for Dolan, who would know within hours if he didn't already, and what it meant for the Calder Ranch, which was about to become the center of something larger than a family's water problem. Whit put both hands flat on the table in that way he had. All right, he said. We go back out day after tomorrow. Anyone who wants to be useful is welcome to come. He looked at Arlen. Bring your own tools. Arlen nodded. He looked at his coffee again. Then he said, without quite looking at either of them, I should have pushed back harder. 6 months ago. A year ago. Should have pushed back then instead of waiting for someone else to find the door. Most people wait, she said. Not unkindly. It takes a particular kind of desperation to stop waiting. He looked at her then. A long, level look, the kind that meant he was hearing more than the words. What brought you to Dust Halo? He said. A dime worth of coffee and nowhere else to be, she said. Same as most people end up where they are. He nodded once, slowly. He finished his coffee. He and his brothers left with the particular energy of men who had come in uncertain and were leaving with a direction. The days that followed had a particular quality that she would remember later as dense, packed close, with events and decisions and the physical labor of returning to the Eastern Flats with more people and better tools, and turning what they'd found into something real. 11 people made the trip, the second time. The Calder brothers minus Cal, who was still minding the property. Arlen and his 2 brothers. 4 other ranchers from the surrounding area, including a woman named Petra, who ran a sheep operation 2 miles north and arrived with her own shovel and her own expression that made clear she didn't expect any conversation about whether she should be there. Eliza was glad for Petra in the way she was glad for the bone-handled knife in her kit, reliable, self-evident, requiring no explanation. The work on the second day was faster because they understood what they were doing, and because 11 people with the right tools were simply more than 5 people with improvised ones. The shoring was reinforced, the opening expanded to a viable width, and by midday they were able to begin the preliminary routing assessment, figuring out where a line from the spring could run, how it could branch, what the terrain would cost them in terms of pipe and labor. She worked alongside everyone else and also moved up and out of the immediate work when she needed to, climbing the ridge to look at the full terrain picture, reading the ground the way she'd read it 2 days before. The routing was complex. The flats were flat in the aggregate but not in the specific, and a water line that fought the terrain instead of following. It was a water line that would fail in seasons. She made the routing diagram on paper this time, sitting on the ridge with the wind hitting her from the east, pencil stub she'd had in her coat pocket, since she couldn't remember when moving across the back of the folded diagram she'd already drawn. Crude. It was accurate enough. When she came back down and showed it to Whit, he stood with it in his hands for a long time, tracing the lines with one finger. "This works," he said. "It's a starting point," she said. "Actual digging will show us things the diagram can't." "I know, but it works." He looked up from the paper at her. "How long have you been thinking about this?" "Since before we left the first time," she said. "The routing question is always the question after you find the source. Anyone who's thought about irrigation for more than a minute knows that." "Have you thought about irrigation for more than 10 minutes? Thomas had 80 acres in Nebraska that needed it," she said. "I thought about it for about 3 years." He was quiet for a moment. He looked back at the diagram. "Did it work? The Nebraska operation?" "Some of it, the parts I managed." She took the diagram back. Parts he managed worked less well. She could feel him on the edge of saying something, asking something more specific about Thomas, about the marriage, about the years before dust halo. She was aware of it the way you're aware of weather without looking at the sky. He didn't ask. He just said, "Good diagram," and walked back to the work. And she folded the paper and put it back in her pocket and went back to work herself, and neither of them said anything else about it. And that was the exact right thing. On the 4th day after the discovery, 3 things happened in the span of a few hours that changed the character of what was happening from a ranching problem to something larger. The first was a rider from town, not Arlen this time, but a man she didn't know, who arrived at the Calder ranch in the early afternoon while most of the brothers were still out at the spring site. She was in the kitchen. She met him at the door. He was young, maybe 19, with the look of someone running an errand he hadn't been told all the details of. He handed her a folded note and looked at her with the particular expression of a person trying to figure out whether he'd given the message to the right person. "Is this the Calder place?" he said. "It is," she said. "Then I reckon it's for whoever's in charge." He looked at the note in her hand, then at her, making the calculation. "Then I reckon it's for me," she said, and closed the door. The note was from Dolan. It didn't announce itself as such. There was no signature, but she knew it the way she'd known things about men like Dolan for most of her adult life. It was short. It said that the eastern flats were adjacent to land Dolan held rights over, and that any water source on or near that land was subject to Dolan's claim, and that anyone drawing from such a source without his authorization was in violation of his legal standing, and that he would be pursuing all appropriate remedies. She read it twice. She set it on the kitchen table and stood looking at it. She was not afraid. She wanted to be precise about that. In her own mind, it wasn't bravery, which implied the presence of fear overcome, but something more specific. She'd been threatened by men with more leverage than Chet Dolan. She'd had the actual ground under her feet, taken by a man with papers and 6 horses. Fear had been the right response then, and she'd felt it, and she'd moved through it. What she felt now was different. It was clarity. The particular clarity that comes when a situation that has been murky finally shows you exactly what it is. Dolan was afraid. That was what the note meant. Not the words, the existence of it. A man who was comfortable with his position didn't send unsigned notes to ranch houses. A man who was certain of his power let his power do the work without commentary. Dolan had sent this note because something had shifted and he knew it, because 11 people on the Eastern Flats 2 days running was a thing that couldn't be kept quiet in a county this size. And the story that went with those 11 people was the story he'd spent decades trying to prevent from being told. She was still standing at the table when Whit came in. She held out the note without saying anything. He read it. His face went through several things, in quick succession: anger, then the controlled management of anger, then the cold calculation that came after. He can claim it, Whit said. The land question is complicated. The Eastern Flats are county territory, not private, but the edges where the Dolan property meets them. Complicated, she said. Yes, which means he can tie this up in legal proceedings long enough to make it not worth the trouble, she said. Point. He doesn't need to win. He needs to make it expensive enough and long enough that people give up. Whit set the note back on the table. So what do we do? She looked at it for a moment. Then she said, we move faster than he can file papers. And we make sure that by the time he gets in front of a judge, there are enough people drawing from that spring, and depending on it, that the political weight of shutting it down is heavier than the legal argument for doing it. He looked at her. You've thought about this. I've thought about most things, she said. It's a habit I find useful. How fast is fast enough? Faster than we've been moving, she said. We need more people at that site. We need the routing laid and the first connections made before the end of the week. And we need people in town talking about what they found and what it means, because public knowledge is harder to litigate against than private action. He was quiet for a long time. She let him be quiet. He was doing what he did, which was thinking before speaking, and she'd come to regard this as one of his better qualities. You understand this could get ugly, he said. Dolan has people. He has the sheriff, I know. You came here for honest work and a place to sleep. I know what I came here for, she said. Things change. He looked at her across the kitchen table with that careful, direct look. He had the look that meant he was seeing her, not a version of her, not a category of person. Seeing her. Eliza, he said. Don't, she said. Not harshly, just clearly. Don't tell me I don't have to be part of this. Don't offer me the door. I know where the door is. I've been knowing where the door is since the first night. I'm still here. A long pause. All right, he said. All right, she agreed. The second thing that happened that day was that Petra, the sheep rancher, arrived at the Calder ranch in the late afternoon with 4 people from town. She'd brought herself not ranchers, townspeople, a feed store owner and his wife, a woman who ran the boarding house, a man who did repairs and maintenance for half the properties in Dust Halo, people who weren't ranchers, people who needed water for different reasons, ordinary reasons, the reasons people need water every day in a town without its own independent supply. Petra stood in the yard with her shovel, still on her shoulder, because she'd apparently come straight from the spring site, and said, I told them what we found. They want to know how they can help. Eliza stood in the doorway of the ranch house and looked at these people tired, uncertain, newly arrived at something they'd been told for years wasn't possible, and felt in the specific interior place where she kept things she didn't put on her face, something she recognized as the feeling of a thing becoming real. The third thing was smaller. It happened after everyone had gone, after the plans had been discussed, and the next day's work arranged, and the kitchen had been cleaned, and the brothers had gone to their rooms, and the house was quiet. She was at the kitchen table with the Dolan note still sitting where she'd left it. She picked it up. She read it one more time. She carried it to the stove, opened the firebox door and set the note on the coals, and watched it go. Then she closed the firebox and went down the hall to the room with the crooked blue curtain. She sat on the edge of the bed. She picked up the iron key from the table. She held it in both hands for a moment, feeling the weight of it, the particular solid weight of something that opened something else. She thought about a Tuesday morning, a front door opening without a knock, a man with papers and 6 horses and a voice that said, "You've got till sundown." She thought about how far she was from that kitchen. 600 miles, give or take. 3 weeks. An entire geography of choices she'd made, one at a time, each one moving her one step further from the person who had stood at a stove with a cast iron ladle and made no sound. She thought about what was coming. The legal challenge, probably. The pressure Dolan would bring. The messiness of a fight that was already more than a waterline and was becoming something about who this county belonged to and who got to decide that. She was not afraid. She was tired, and her shoulders ached, and she had work to do in the morning. Put the key back on the table, not because she wasn't ready for it, but because she was, which meant she could afford to wait one more night to let the readiness sit in her, in the sea, solid and certain, the way water sits in stone, patient, going nowhere, waiting for the ground above it to finally give way. She lay down. Outside, the wind had stopped. The night was very quiet, the specific quiet of a country that has finished saying what it had to say for the day and is simply waiting for what comes next. Closed her eyes and was asleep in 3 minutes, which was the fastest she'd fallen asleep since she arrived, and she didn't notice, because she was already gone. The week that followed moved the way hard weeks do, not fast, not slow, but with a particular grinding weight that made each day feel like it had more hours in it than the calendar allowed. The work at the spring site continued. Every morning before dawn, Eliza was in the kitchen. Every morning, the group that assembled at the Calder ranch before heading out to the eastern flats was larger than the day before. By the third morning, it was 19 people. By the fifth, it was closer to 30, which was a number that created its own logistical problems. Too many people in a confined work area, without coordination, became chaos faster than it became progress, and she spent as much time directing the flow of effort as she did working herself. She didn't have a title for what she was doing. Nobody gave her one. She was simply the person who knew where things needed to go, and said so clearly and without hesitation. And people followed that clarity the way people always follow clarity when they're tired and cold and need someone to point at the next right thing. Petra was invaluable. The sheep rancher had a practical intelligence that expressed itself in immediate physical terms. She saw a problem. She solved it. She moved to the next one, and she did it with the kind of unself-conscious competence that Eliza recognized and respected deeply. On the fourth day at the site, when a shoring plank split under unexpected ground pressure and the east wall of the expanded opening threatened to shift, it was Petra who grabbed the replacement timber before anyone else had processed what was happening and got it into position while Eliza directed the bracing from above. They didn't congratulate each other afterward. They just looked at the fixed wall, confirmed it was holding, and went back to work. The routing was the hardest part. Not physically. The digging was the hardest part, the frozen ground fighting them every foot of the way, the cold unrelenting and uninterested in their schedule. The routing required decisions that had consequences that would outlast the current cold season and the current urgency and the current group of people standing in a field with shovels. Decisions made wrong now would mean a water system that failed in 3 years, or that served some properties and starved others, or that created new dependencies as limiting as the one they were trying to break. She made those decisions carefully. She walked the terrain 3 times before committing to the primary line route. She asked questions of the ranchers and townspeople who knew their own properties, where their existing infrastructure was, what their seasonal water needs looked like, where they'd had problems as before. She listened to the answers without pretending she'd already known them, which was sometimes the harder skills. Arlen Bott, who had been one of the first to arrive and had worked every day since, without exception, stopped her one afternoon at the edge of the work area. "You've done this before," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "Parts of it," she said. "Not exactly this, but the thinking part, figuring out how it connects part." "Yes," she said. "I've done that before." He nodded slowly. Dolan sent his man around yesterday to the properties in town, reminding people of his legal claim, suggesting that anyone participating in what's happening out here is exposing themselves to liability. He said the last word carefully, like someone handling something sharp. Did it work? Mrs. Garfield from the boarding house got nervous, he said, thought about pulling back. Then Petra told her something and she changed her mind. What did Petra tell her? I don't know exactly, but Mrs. Garfield showed up this morning with her nephew and a pickaxe. Eliza looked at the work site, the people moving across it, the organized motion of a group that had found its rhythm over several days, the sound of tools in frozen ground that had become a kind of constant low music. Dolan's going to escalate, she said. The legal note was first. There'll be something else. I know, Arlen said. What do we do about it? We finish what we started, she said, as we can. Every day it's done is a day it's harder to undo. He looked at her steadily. And if he comes with the sheriff? Then we have 30 people and a functioning water system and a county judge who has to weigh Dolan's paper claim against the practical reality that half the county has been drawing from that spring for 2 weeks. She held his gaze. Paper claims lose to practical realities more often than people think, especially when the practical reality has 30 witnesses. Arlen was quiet for a moment. Then he said, simply, all right, and went back to work. Dolan came himself on the 8th day. She'd expected it. Not the exact timing, but the fact of it, a man like Dolan didn't send notes and messengers indefinitely. At some point, the situations required his personal attention, because his personal attention was the thing that had always been enough before. The arrival of Chet Dolan meant the end of the conversation, in the experience of everyone in Dust Halo County. It meant the thing was decided, because he had decided it, and what followed was just the logistics of submission. He rode up to the Calder ranch in the middle of the afternoon, with 3 men behind him, which she noticed was fewer than the 6 he'd had at the Mercer homestead. She noticed because details like that were how you read a situation before it told you what it was. 6 men said, I'm certain. 3 men said, I'm making a point. The reduction was information. She was at the spring site when it happened. Whit was at the ranch. She found out about it from Cal, who rode out to the flats to tell her, his horse breathing hard from the pace. He's at the house, Cal said. Whit said, you should know. What's Whit doing? Talking to him. On the front porch. Not letting him inside. A pause. He asked me to come get you. She handed her pickaxe to Petra without explanation. Petra took it without asking for one. She rode back with Cal. Dolan was not what she'd expected physically. She'd constructed an image of him from the months of proximity to his effects, the debt papers, the 6 horses in her yard, the unsigned note, the water line packed with rock and clay, and the image she'd built was large and deliberate. The actual man was medium height, well dressed for the frontier in a way that read Rez's effort, with a face that might have been considered handsome a decade ago and was now on the other side of that, the softness of comfort having settled into it in ways that didn't improve it. He was standing on the front porch when she arrived. Whit was between him and the door. The 3 men who'd ridden with Dolan were at the bottom of the porch steps, and she noted that they were arranged in the particular way of men who have been told to look substantial rather than to do anything. She dismounted and tied the horse and walked to the porch without hurrying. Dolan looked at her. She'd expected the dismissal, the brief glance that placed a woman in the category of not relevant, and moved on. She didn't get it. He looked at her with the particular attention of a man who has done his research since the note wasn't answered the way he expected. Mrs. Mercer, he said. She hadn't told anyone her name in connection with what they were doing. She filed this away. Mr. Dolan, she said. I was just explaining to Mr. Calder that the situation out on the eastern flats has some legal complexity that everyone seems to be ignoring. I'm familiar with your note, she said. She stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, which put her below him. She'd have preferred to be on the porch, but she wasn't going to push past his men to get there, not because she was afraid to, but because that was exactly the kind of move that gave someone like Dolan a story to tell. Stayed where she was and looked up at him without adjusting her posture. Eastern flats are county territory. Your property boundary ends at the surveyed line, which is approximately 400 yards from where the spring opens. He looked at her with the expression of a man recalibrating. The water source may extend beneath land. I hold rights over. The water source is on county land, she said. A buried spring on county territory, deliberately blocked, which is itself an interesting legal question if anyone wanted to pursue it. Something moved in his face. Not fear. Men like Dolan didn't show fear because they'd spent their entire adult lives making sure they never had to. But something adjacent. A recognition. I don't know what you think happened to that spring, he said. His voice was still controlled, still carrying the particular easy authority of a man accustomed to rooms quieting when he spoke. I think I know exactly what happened to it, she said. And I think you know I know. And I think that's why you're here in person instead of sending another note. The three men at the bottom of the steps shifted. She was aware of Whit on the porch above and behind her, very still, the way he got when he was paying complete attention. Dolan looked at her for a long moment. She held the look without flinching and without any particular expression on her face. She'd had this conversation before, in different rooms with different words, and she knew what it was. It was the moment when a man who'd operated for a long time on the assumption that the people around him would eventually yield was discovering that this particular person was not going to yield, and he was calculating what to do with that information. You're a long way from where you started, Mrs. Mercer, he said. The shift in his tone was subtle, not quite a threat, but pointed. A woman traveling alone, no property, no legal standing in this county. Correct, she said, which means I have nothing you can take. A silence. This isn't finished, he said. No, she agreed. But it's further along than you'd like it to be, and it's going to keep going further. So the question you should actually be thinking about isn't whether you can stop it legally. It's whether the fight costs you more than it costs us. She kept her voice level. We have nothing to lose, Mr. Dolan. You have a reputation, a business, and a county full of people who are currently in the process of remembering that they don't need you. Different calculation. He said nothing. She let the silence sit. Then he turned and walked down the steps, and his three men moved aside, and he mounted his horse and rode out without looking back, which was the only dignified exit available to him, and he was smart enough to know it and take it. She watched him go. Whit came down from the porch and stood beside her. That was a risk, he said. Everything is a risk, she said. I told Arlen the same thing last week. He'll come back, or he'll try the legal route. He might, she said, but he won't get what he came here for today, and that matters more right now than what he does next. She turned toward the house. I need to get back to the flats. We're 2 days from having the primary line connected. He put his hand on her arm. She stopped. It was the first time he'd touched her not intimately, just the direct, unadorned contact of a man who needed someone to stop moving for a moment. Thank you, he said, for that, for all of it. She looked at him. He was serious and unguarded in a way she'd seen from him maybe twice since she'd arrived, and she understood it cost him something to be unguarded, the same way it cost her. You offered me a week's work, she said. I took it. It's not what I mean, and you know it. She was quiet for a moment. The wind moved across the yard, picking up a little dirt and setting it back down. I know, she said. You're welcome. She went back to the flats. Primary line connected on the 10th day. Not cleanly, there were 2 points along the route where the ground had done unexpected things and required adjustment, which added hours and frustration, and one moment where Remy sat down in the frozen dirt and put his face in his hands for 60 seconds before standing up and going back to work. Connected. The first water reached the Calder ranch in the late afternoon, running through the new line and into the trough by the barn, and the sound of it water moving through pipe, water arriving where it was supposed to arrive, was the plainest possible sound, and it was also the best sound she'd heard in months. Cattle knew before the people did. She watched them move toward the trough with the matter-of-fact certainty of animals that understood something had changed and did not require an explanation of how. Cal stood at the fence with both arms resting on the top rail and watched the cattle drink and didn't say a word. After a while, he said, "We're going to be all right." "You were going to be all right anyway," she said. "This just makes it a shorter road." He looked at her sideways. "Is that what you think? That we would have found another way?" She considered it honestly. "I think Whit would have found something. I think it would have cost more and taken longer and been harder." She looked at the trough. "I think you needed someone who didn't know it was supposed to be impossible." Cal nodded slowly. "Where did you come from?" he said. Not in a mystified way. Just the genuine question of a young man trying to understand something. "A kitchen in Kansas," she said. "Before that, a road. Before that, a marriage that wasn't what either of us expected." She looked at the cattle at the trough. "Mostly I came from figuring out what to do next. Same as most people. The Dolan legal challenge came as expected. Came in the form of a filing in the county court claiming water rights adjacent to the Eastern Flats. And it arrived on a Thursday, which was 12 days after the spring had been opened. By Thursday, 23 properties were drawing from the spring. The boarding house, the feed store, 4 sheep operations, 11 cattle ranches, and a family that grew vegetables east of town and had been hauling water from the Dolan well at ruinous rates for 2 years. By Thursday, the short story of what had happened, the buried spring, the water line deliberately packed with rock, the 11 people who'd gone out to the flats with shovels, was the only story anyone in Dust Halo was telling. Dolan's legal filing required a response. Whit hired the only attorney within reasonable distance, a practical man from Laramie who read the filing, read the land survey, and told Whit that the case was defensible and that public use established over a short period was a thin but real argument, and that if the judge was a reasonable man, they had a fair chance. The judge turned out to be a reasonable man. He was also a man who had been quietly paying Dolan's water rates for his own property in town for 3 years and was not actively sorry to be confronted with a legal reason to side against them. The hearing was brief. The surveyed boundary was clear. The spring was on county land. The question of whether the spring had been deliberately blocked was raised, and while it couldn't be proven in the specific, the particular kind of rock and clay that had sealed it was not the kind that occurred naturally in that formation, and the attorney from Laramie made sure the court understood that. Filing was dismissed. Eliza heard about it from Arlen, who rode out to the ranch the same afternoon with his hat in his hand and an expression she's seen from him before open. Unguarded, the face of a man setting something down that he'd been carrying a long time. "Done," he said. Judge dismissed it. She was in the kitchen. She set down what she was holding. She stood very still for a moment. "All right," she said. "That's all you've got? All right. What would you like me to say, Arlen?" He laughed. Came out of him like something that had been stored under pressure, genuine and slightly startled, the laugh of a man who hadn't expected to feel this particular way about this particular moment. "I don't know," he said. "Something you did this." "We did this," she said. 30 people with shovels did this. You and Petra and Hale and Remy and Mrs. Garfield with her nephew did this. Pointed us at it. "Someone had to," she said. "It might as well have been me." He shook his head, still smiling. Put his hat back on. At the door he paused. "Dolan's talking about selling," he said. "The well, the property adjacent. Word is, he's had 2 conversations with buyers from the east already. Let him sell," she said. "You're not worried he'll find another angle?" "He might," she said. "But he can't unbury that spring. And he can't make people forget they dug it out themselves. That's the part that doesn't go away." Arlen looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded once, the slow, particular nod of a man filing something away for later, and left. Stood in the kitchen. Outside, the wind was doing what it always did, moving through whatever it found in the yard and making it known. Stove was warm. The coffee was hot. The water in the kitchen pot had come through the new line that morning, cold and clear, and she had made the coffee with it, and it tasted like water that had been going somewhere for a long time and had finally arrived. That evening, after supper, after the kitchen was clean and the brothers had dispersed to their various ends of the house, Whit came into the kitchen and stood in the doorway the way he did sometimes when he had something to say and hadn't yet decided how to say it. She was at the counter. She waited. He reached into his coat pocket and held out his hand. In his palm was the iron key from the table in the sewing room. She'd left it there this morning, as she had every morning. She looked at it now in his hand. "I thought you should have this properly," he said, "not just sitting on a table." "It's been sitting on the table the whole time," she said. "I know." He kept his hand out. "I'm saying it differently now." She looked at the key. She thought about the first night she'd seen it, the crooked curtain, the rough table, the cedar box underneath, the particular solidity of something small that meant you are here, and what is yours stays yours. She thought about a kitchen in Kansas and a man who came through the door without knocking, and how far she'd walked since then, and how different the ground felt under her feet now than it had on that road outside the homestead, alone, with one dime and a canvas sack and the decision to keep moving. She reached out and took the key. It was heavier than she remembered, or she was more aware of the weight. She held it in her fingers and felt it, the real iron weight of it, the small future it represented. The room at the end of the hall that had been built for her by 6 brothers who hadn't known her name 3 weeks ago. "You don't have to keep one foot out the door," Whit said. He said it quietly, plainly, without performance. It was one of the things she'd come to trust about him, that he said what he meant without decoration, which meant when he said something, it was the thing itself, and not a dressed-up version of it. She closed her hand around the key. She didn't say anything immediately. She stood with it for a moment, letting it be what it was, not a promise, not a declaration, not any of the large and complicated things she might have made of it if she were a different kind of person. Just a room, just the simple and radical fact of a place that was hers. "I'm going to unlock that box," she said finally. "I figured you would," he said. "The letter in my coat pocket," she said, "my sister. I've been carrying it for 4 months, I know." He paused. "You mentioned it once. You probably don't remember." She did remember. She'd mentioned it in the dark, half asleep, on one of the early mornings, when they'd both been in the kitchen before 4, and the house was very quiet, and conversation had happened. The way conversation sometimes happens in the dark, without the usual armor, without the usual care. "I'm going to read it," she said. "That seems right," he said. She looked at him. He was standing in the kitchen doorway with his coat on and his hands at his sides, and his face carrying the particular expression she'd learned to read over the past weeks, careful and directed and not asking for more than what was offered, which was the thing about him that had made her trust him before she intended to. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. "I want to say that plainly, because I've been letting it be implied, and I don't think implied is good enough anymore." Something in his face shifted, not dramatically, just the slight change of a man who has been holding a question in reserve and has received the answer to it. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. He went to his room. She stayed in the kitchen for a while longer, the key in her hand, the stove warm at her back. She took the letter from her coat pocket, the folded envelope, soft at the creases from 4 months of being carried. She looked at her sister's handwriting on the front, careful, neat, the same handwriting that had been writing her letters since they were children. She opened it. She read it standing at the kitchen counter. It said what she'd known. It would say her sister, being her sister, had found the right words in the right order, had said, "I hope you are somewhere safe," had said, "I am not angry," had said, "Come find me when you're ready," had said, "I have been thinking about you every day." She read it twice. She stood with it in her hands. She was not going to cry. She was aware of the option and declined it, the way she declined it on the road outside the Mercer homestead, the way she declined it in the first kitchen of the first nights in this house. Not because feeling things was wrong, but because there was a time for it, and the kitchen counter at 9 o'clock at night was not quite the place. She folded the letter carefully. She put it back in her pocket. She would write back in the morning. She had things to tell her sister, a town called Dust Halo, a spring on the eastern flats, 6 brothers and a crooked blue curtain, a key that was currently in her hand. She walked down the hall. She stopped at the door of the sewing room. She put the key in the padlock on the cedar box, which was what the key had always been for, and turned it. The lock opened. She set her canvas sack inside the box and closed the lid and left the lock open, because a lock you have to use all the time is not a lock. It's a warning, and she was done living under warnings. She sat on the edge of the bed. She looked at the crooked curtain. She thought about the kind of people who hang a curtain. Crooked, people in a hurry, people doing their best with imperfect tools, people who care more about the fact of the curtain than the level of it. She thought that those were the best kind of people to be around, the ones for whom the doing matters more than the perfection of the doing. She thought about what she had learned or relearned or finally understood in the way that understandings sometimes requires being broken down to almost nothing first. That dependence is not the same as belonging. That belonging is something you build with your hands and your time and your particular willingness to stay when staying is harder than leaving. That the people who matter are not always the ones who were there at the beginning. Sometimes they are the ones who are there at the lowest point, who offer a week's work and a cup of coffee and a key they made themselves because they didn't have anything grander to offer. That the most dangerous thing a powerful person can do is teach you to forget what you once had. And the most powerful thing you can do in return is remember it, dig it out from under everything they piled on top of it, and let it run. She thought about Chet Dolan, who had walked into her kitchen without knocking and given her till sundown. She thought about how that moment, which had felt like the end of something, turned out to be the beginning of the last road she'd needed to take. Funny, how the thing meant to stop you was the same thing that moved you. Funny, how the people who think they're closing doors are sometimes just pointing you toward the window. She lay down. She was tired in the good way, the earned way, the way that meant the body and the mind had both been used fully and were ready to be still. She did not sleep in her clothes. She had thought when she finally reached a place that felt like hers that it would feel dramatic somehow, that there would be a clear moment, a line crossed, a door closed, a before and an after she could point to. But it wasn't like that. It was quiet and ordinary, the way most real things are. She was in a room with a crooked curtain. She was not wearing her coat. Her canvas sack was in a box with an open lock, and the letter from her sister was in her pocket. And tomorrow she would write back and say, "I am somewhere safe and I am not leaving." Outside, wind moved through the yard. Somewhere in the house, Cole was playing his harmonica something slow, something that had a shape to it now. Not the wandering half-formed melody of the early evenings, but something that had been practiced, something that was beginning to sound like a song. She listened to it. The curtain moved slightly in a draft from the window, tilting on its crooked rod, and she looked at it in the dark and thought, "I'll fix that in the morning." Then she decided to leave it. Some things were right exactly as they were.